Welcome to the Petersen's Bowhunting Podcast. All bowhunting, all the time. Now, here's your host, editor Christian Berg.
All right, welcome back to the Bowhunting Podcast. We are all bowhunting all the time, and today we have an absolutely fascinating episode. You know, when we think about the best deer hunters around the country, it's tempting, to think about big personalities, the folks you see on television, maybe the folks you see in the pages of Petersen's Bowhunting. But honestly, most of the really, really great deer hunters, and there are a lot of them out there, are guys that you're never going to know. And I want to thank my buddy John Silks, Petersen's Bowhunting gear editor. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for tipping me off to this week's episode, because our other guest is a fellow Pennsylvania bow hunter, Steve Sherk. Steve, thanks for being with us today.
Oh, absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And Steve is here because John told me, hey, listen, Christian, we have got to get Steve Sherk back on the podcast because you joined us once before, Steve, and we talked about some other trail camera stuff, but you have been doing a long-term trail camera study using 100, 150, even as many as 170 trail cameras scattered throughout, a wide area of your hunting territory in Pennsylvania. And you run these things for several months throughout the archery season every year. And you're cataloging all the data that you're getting in terms of the deer movement with other environmental conditions. And you have actually come up with some amazing conclusions and learned some things that we can all benefit from to be better hunters. And it's absolutely fascinating. So, with that as an introduction, and I got to actually do one more thing, guys. I got to remind you who brings us the podcast, guys. And trail cameras is a great topic because if you need trail cameras, you know where you want to go, John? Take one guess, John.
You tell me.
Lancaster Archery Supply. They got them all. So for all your bow hunting needs, visit lancasterarchery.com. They've got the gear.
Position to name a particular trail camera. I was like, I'm not doing that.
Oh, no. I was thinking you're going to talk about our buddies down there in Lancaster. No. They've got the gear. They've got the knowledge, and they've got the passion. So they've got the passion for archery and all the good archery stuff. Steve, you've got the passion for running those trail cameras out in the field. So why don't you just start out by telling us, how did this whole project get started? And I can't imagine it started with 170 cameras.
No, it didn't. It was sort of by accident, but, just combing through trail cam photos and, looking through SD cards, mainly after the season, I would notice just certain days, basically probably at the time, say 7-8 years ago, I was probably only running anywhere from 30 to 50 cameras. But I just noticed on certain days, holy cow, why were most of my trail cameras, so active these days, and other days, they weren't. And, I started trying to find more sense in it. And, so then, I started to pay a little bit more attention to, certain factors like moon and temperature and, even sometimes precipitation and, several others. But after I kind of dabbled into it a little bit, I really wanted to take the research seriously because I really started to see that, there was going to be really something to take from it. And so I did want to start with 100 trail cameras. And that was, like I said, roughly about 6 years ago. And that year, I kept track of moon phase, barometric pressure, wind shifts, wind changes, temperature, obviously. And I honestly thought that either moon or barometric pressure was going to be kind of like the ultimate clue as far as, when you're going to see these spikes in movement. But after the first year I did it, I was completely wrong. Temperature just crushed everything. And that really started to get me thinking. And, as I went on doing it for the next couple years, temperature kept winning the game, kept showing the most productivity, in certain days, certain weather events. So, in the past few years, I really have only focused on temperature.
So,
Um,
Steve, are you looking at all deer, or are you looking at mature bucks?
yeah, right. That's a good that you brought that up. So it's only bucks. Just I dabbled into it, like I said, 7, 8 years ago. I tried keeping track of all deer, and I did find that it just seemed like does were less affected, by weather events than bucks. Like bucks seem to be more, uh, just more picky about when they really want to move, and especially mature deer. But the problem with trying to do mature deer, at least early on, I thought was it's not always easy to judge on a trail cam photo if that's a mature deer or not. So I mainly have just done bucks, whether it doesn't even have to be a legal buck, anything with antlers. The past few years. But last season I did do mature bucks, and I actually thought it went pretty well, better than what I thought. There was a lot of deer, like I never guessed. Like if I wasn't for sure that it was at least what I judge as a mature buck as a 4.5-year old or older, I did count it. But we can talk about that a little bit later on too. But just make sure I explain this thoroughly. So my camera spread is all on public land. It's roughly a 30-mile stretch, maybe by like 15 miles wide in northern Pennsylvania. So I feel like I have a good enough broadcast of trail cameras, or a good enough spread. Like I think it makes the study, I think it makes it more valuable, and it's not all in just one small area. I think I get better results that way too. So that's kind of why I, spread it out like that, mainly just to make sure, that I was given the data a fair chance to be accurate. Right. And then also the dates I do the study are roughly October 1st to December 10th, which those are pretty much the entire period of archery season in Pennsylvania as well as gun season.
So you have these things spread out across many, many thousands of acres. Talk to me just a little bit about how do you pick your camera location?
I try to be very diverse in it. I'm not really focusing on one thing, except what I have been doing a lot, whether it's a travel corridor or, next to a food source. I usually put a mock scrape, or sometimes I get lucky and there's a scrape in that area. The reason why a lot of them are on scrapes is it's it's the one thing you can count on in the woods that you can get a buck to stop at. A lot of the other situations and setups, like you just don't get a good angle, or you don't get a buck to stick around long enough to really get to know whether it's sometimes a big buck, mature buck, or how many points it has. So I use those scrapes also to just to really get a good idea of what the deer is. And then secondly, too, a scrape, in my opinion, gives a reason for a deer to come back to a certain location. Like a lot of these bucks come back multiple times throughout the year, sometimes even multiple times in a week. So it's a good way to get a deer to want to come to right in front of that camera, more often, especially. But overall, like I said, I've got cameras in bottoms and high elevations. I try to spread them out in a lot of different areas, because once again, I want to get as much data. I want to give the study a fair chance to be extremely accurate and useful. So I'm trying to put them in a lot of various locations.
Well, and that's what I wanted to hear, because again, you're talking about drawing some conclusions, and it's a broad, you're casting a pretty wide net here, covering a variety of habitats, probably some open areas, some field edges. So like you said, some ridge tops, some bottoms, probably some areas along, creeks or rivers or crossings and things like that. So you've really got it covered well. And
Yeah.
and again, you're looking at deer, across a wide enough area where, when you talk about the herd that you're monitoring, it's not just one localized deer population. There are deer within your study area that those home ranges, I'm sure, don't even come close to intersecting.
Yeah, exactly. And also in my guiding business, it kind of bodes well too, because the more cameras I have out, and especially in a wider area, the more big deer we're going to locate, the more I'm able to spread out hunters. Like, it works in a lot of different, a lot of good beneficial ways, not just for the study, but I feel that, it's pretty important if you're going to run a lot of cameras to give them a good spread, whether it's not just in, multiple different types of habitats and, different elevations, but, cover as much ground as you can too. I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know before we started recording, we talked about you've probably cataloged well over 1 million, maybe multiple millions of trail camera images over the 6 years or so that you've been doing this. So let's just dive right in. I mean, this is what people are dying to know, right? What are the conclusions that you've drawn? And I guess you want to start out with talking about that temperature, because you said you've identified that as the number one factor. So what are some of the parameters that you've discovered? And then we can take it from there.
Yeah. I mean, there's things that happen every year, or, things that you can say, like, for one, a lot of people love the early part of archery season in Pennsylvania. Some people say that's the best period, but actually, in the years I've been doing it, it's always been the worst period for movement. Our best stretches of movement.
You're telling me that I have to let actual hard and fast, indisputable data, mess up my fanciful notions of archery season?
I can only tell you what I found, but it definitely doesn't. Since I've done this study, like, it definitely plays a role into when you want to hunt, and whether it's time of year, and or like if it's real warm out, I'm not as excited anymore. But what I kind of wanted to bring up was, like, the early part of October is always slow. Now, even if you get good temperatures, yes, you will see spikes in movement. The temperature is a factor at almost any time of year, except it does seem to have an opposite effect in the winter, which, I don't want to go too all over the place right yet. But my point is, like, what we do see somewhat similar every year is our best streaks of movement. And if you were to maybe boil it down within a few weeks, would either be the last week of October or first 2 weeks of November. That's always when we have our greatest period of movement. But I will say, in the past 3 years, it's been a different week. So some people will tell you that it doesn't matter, weather or hunting pressure or anything else, but some people believe, like, say roughly like November, 2nd to the 9th or something is always going to be the best. And we have not seen that. There's always been big differences every year. In 2020, the best stretch of movement was the last week of October. In 2021, the best stretch was first week in November. And 2022 was second week of November, and even actually going more into the third week. It was really late last year for the best movement. But I will say, those were always the coldest weeks, which, once again, we talk about temperature. So it also, it is the heat of the rut, which I would agree, like, somewhere within those few weeks, you're going to be in that peak rut situation, but it's the temperature still has a huge effect on when these bucks are really starting to range out. It doesn't matter.
If you have a temperature drop during one of those weeks, you better be in.
Absolutely. That's why,
That asked one of Andy's questions too. He said he wanted me to ask you if, weather aside, you had to pick a 5-day stretch to hunt, when would it be? But it sounds to me like, it would be just anytime you had time during those 3 weeks?
Yeah, well, yes and no. Like if I couldn't use weather, I still probably would go with the latter part of October, like maybe the 25th to 31st, because the one thing about that, those days, every year, somewhere within, maybe you break it down into a 3-day period within that week, we always have a good spike in movement. And I think then, like, that is a time period when there's not many does available, but yet bucks are really starting to get on their feet and look. Because when you start having more does coming to heat, a lot of your bucks get locked down into those areas. People think lockdown, once again, is always a certain week, but really, there's periods throughout November in different areas when different does are coming into heat. And like I said, you want, as a hunter, at least for me, I want the more bucks on their feet looking for that hot doe, the better. But once they find that hot doe, that can shut an area right down.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because
and
they're all somewhere. And if you're not in, if you're not there, then you think that the rut's over, it's terrible and everything, but just a ridge away, all
Yes,
is breaking loose.
exactly.
Right.
You want to be where it's just very widespread, bucks moving like crazy. And you'll find that more in late October than anything else.
Yeah, and the other thing that we're talking about here is, when you mentioned earlier, Steve, that a lot of people will say, well, it's always going to be, say, between like the 2nd and the 9th of November. I think what we're talking about there, and I don't argue with this, it's based on mean conception date. And I agree with the biologists that say that's not really going to vary very much from year to year, that mean conception date. And of course, they can do their studies and get data by, measuring fetuses and things like that after the fact and figuring out when the vast majority of the does are bred. But again, what we're talking about is when can you capitalize as a hunter? Because the rut is going to happen regardless of whether it's 100 degrees or 0 degrees or anywhere in between. That's not going to change. And I don't think we're arguing with that. What we're talking about is, unfortunately, if it's 100 degrees, almost all that rut activity is going to happen at night, and it's of no use to you as a hunter. And so what you want to do is within that period of late October to mid-November, when these things are going to be happening, when are they most likely to be happening? During legal shooting hours, when you can actually use it to your advantage.
Exactly. Yep. I always tell, even like my clients, I say, just because it's even 70 degrees, it doesn't mean that the rut isn't going on. And even there's always some movement. And even outside of the rut, like deer don't just lay in their beds for 8 to 12 hours a day. They get up some, but like John brought up, it's unless it's a prime weather day, a lot of that movement is very centralized, and it's so much harder to get in that window or to find that. It's just makes it much harder. So it's just one of those things I've found that the further deer are moving, and bucks especially, the greater your odds go up.
So let's get into some details, okay? Because you talked about the coldest week during that, last week of October, first week of November. The last 3 years has been the best week. But I mean, we got to get a lot more specific than that. What's cold? And now, again, we're in Pennsylvania. So if you live in, Virginia, it's probably not going to be as cold. If you live in Maine, it's going to be colder. So I think there's some relativity to what we're going to talk about here that people have to sort of apply to their particular areas.
Yeah. Is it temperature or is it temperature change?
Temperature, actually, I've found is more important than temperature change. Now, I will say though, a drastic temperature change, like, when I shot my PA buck last year on November 12th, it was 60 degrees at midnight. And then later in that day, it was in the 30s. Like, there was just a crazy temperature drop. And November 12th was a top 5 day for this study last year as far as buck movement. So, I mean, that certainly was a huge factor. And it definitely is really important and something to pay attention to. But, in the years I've been doing this, what I'm finding is like you need it under 40 degrees for a high, and you want lows like 32 or colder. I can't say I've seen very few days, even here in northern Pennsylvania, where I had lows like in the teens. So I don't know if there's anything such as too cold either. Probably not, during the rut. But anytime I'm seeing, like I said, temps in the 30s and the lows in the freezing or below freezing mark, always a tremendous spike in movement. And if those temperatures stay the same, even for 10 days straight, like some people will say that stagnant weather or stagnant temperatures start to have an effect on deer movement. I've seen completely opposite of that. Whenever you have prime temps, I would say from October 15th to November 15th, you will see very, very good movement. It could stay like that for 2 weeks, and I think the movement would still stay pretty good.
All right, Steve, I want to repeat what you said because people don't want to miss that. If it's 40 degrees or below as a high, and the low temperature is freezing or below, those are the days that you want to key on, and you want to hunt as much as you can on any of those days. Even if you get 4 or 5 or 6 in a row, that fifth or sixth day could be just as good as the first day.
Absolutely. In the data that I have, if that cold weather stays consistent 98% of the time, you'll look at the charts and they're still booming. So I don't see anything as far as like stagnant weather, or you need like 2 to 3 days and then a weather change. I don't see that at all. If you have prime temps given the right time of year, the movement will stay very good.
Okay, now let's get specific. Again, we talked some specifics on temperatures. Let's get specific on movement. And okay, let's start with this. On a percentage basis or a multiples basis, how much more movement, and again, we're talking buck movement here, how much more buck movement are you documenting on average on one of these cold days that we just described versus another day that doesn't meet those temperature criteria?
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Like I can even say, like, for instance, well, let me also put this. This is an interesting factor too, and then I'll jump onto your question. But so in 2021, our best day for this study, most pictures, was November 6th. In 2022, the worst day we had was November 6th. So that's very interesting too. However, November 6th in 2022 was like highs in the 70s, lows in the 60s. So it was completely dead. And also keeping track of mature buck photos, out of 170 plus cameras you would think somewhere on any camera you would have got a mature deer. We had 0 mature buck photos on November 6th last year. We did get maybe 4 or 5. I wish I had that exact number with me, but a handful of pictures on November 6th of just small bucks. But then you throw in we got to November 12th when the temperatures started to change, and we're getting like 20 to 30 photos on those days. So you're talking like less than 5 photos or sequences of movement versus, so it's tripling or quadrupling at least.
Well, it's actually six times. I mean, if you go from 5 to 30, that's 6 times the amount of mature buck activity on a cold day as you're getting on a sort of a unseasonably warm day.
Absolutely. We only had, I believe, 3 mature buck photos through the entire study last year on any day that it was either highs in the 40s or 50s or 60s, whatever. Unless it was what I call a 30-30 day, when you have temps once again in the 30s and lows in 32 or below, I mean, we only had a handful of mature deer pictures on those days out of 170 some cameras.
John, did you hear what he just said? He should trademark that 30-30, the 30-30 buck hunting method, Steve Sherk's 30-30 club.
That's
The
what I've
the only
honestly
time
been
I go
telling.
in the woods.
Yeah. Yeah, it's for hunters, it's a good way to remember that, like a 30-30 day, because the old 30-30 used to be the most popular deer hunting rifle.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you what, Steve, it's fascinating, but it's also a little, I mean, it's encouraging and depressing all at the same time, because a lot of guys just like to hunt. And maybe the takeaway here is like, hey, if you just love to sit in the woods, that's fine. Like, it is nice to sit in the woods, but if it's not a 30-30 day and you've got an easy, real comfortable ladder stand that's only like 100 yards from the truck, just go sit in that stand every time it's not a 30-30 day, because all you're really doing is sitting in the woods. So you want to go sit in the woods, go sit in the woods. But when you get a 30-30 day, you're actually going to hunt and kill. And that's when you do your hunting and you do your sitting on the non-30-30 days.
That's absolutely a great point. And I talk about that a lot too. Like, you know, I always believe in this, and the study kind of backs it up, that, hunt your best spots on the best days. And, why go in there and put a whole bunch of human scent in a spot when it's very unlikely that, deer's going to come in there, while you're there, during daytime hours. So chances are, buck's going to come in there at night and know that someone's been in here during the daytime, versus, like you said, you could have just some other stands just to, because for a lot of us, it's not always about the kill, obviously, and just being out there. And you don't want to miss out on a free opportunity of hunting. If you can get out there, get out there. But the overall point is hunt your best stands when the weather's prime. I totally agree with that.
Now, let's go back to something else that you talked about a little while ago, and I'm really curious on this. You talked about scrapes. Obviously, you can use, either by putting a dripper on a real scrape or creating a mock scrape. You can use that honestly year round. Deer will be curious about that. You can get them there. But when it comes to that pre-rut period, when bucks will tend to make quite a few scrapes in and around their core area, their travel corridors, as they're kind of still somewhat predictable before the full rut kicks in and it gets a little more chaotic. What have you identified through your study in terms of scrape activity or frequency of visits to scrapes? Is there a definable period where that peaks? And if so, is that something that you've incorporated into your own hunting strategy or what you do with your clients?
Yes, I have found that's something pretty consistent every year. I've seen more consistency from individual bucks returning to scrapes probably from October 15th to Halloween. After that, they're much more unpredictable. Now, I will say sometimes when, I also believe that a buck can sense when a doe is getting ready to come into heat. Like, if it's a few days away, I believe they can start to sense it. And what I will see is, like, if you have a hot doe or a doe that's almost coming into heat, and maybe there's a scrape like on the edge of a doe bedding area, you will see a consistency as far as a buck keep coming back to that scrape and communicating with her. And that could be, any time in the rut, but usually like, for 2 weeks in November. But if it's at that time of year, it's more about finding the right scrape that's being hit versus that later October period. Bucks are really going around like checking a lot of scrapes and working a lot of scrapes. I also think it's more about them marking their territory and putting their name in spots, and versus once you get into that November period, I think it's more about communicating with other does. I think that has a lot to do with especially trying to find a doe that's getting ready to be bred.
On that subject, Steve, I've learned a little bit, but from looking at your trail camera pictures, and something that we do, you have scrapes take on a variety of, sizes and, seems like effort that's put into them from the bucks. It seems like, the scrapes that we're finding our activity on and what looks like the scrapes that I see on some of your cameras are not these little football size, two stroke scrapes. They are scrapes that are
Yeah.
sizable and visited not just by bucks, but by a variety of deer.
That's absolutely correct. I'm not just setting cameras on any scrape I find. I've got enough experience where I feel like I know what to look for, and scrape size is one of them. I don't put a lot of cameras and places where I feel there's a lot of night activity. I mean, I do have a few cameras in those spots because sometimes you can at least get inventory from those. But I'm looking for scrapes around thick cover or in more remote areas where I can get better daytime movement. And the other thing too about scrapes is I have seen, like, this is specifically from hunting over scrapes and watching bucks work them. Like, I've seen one buck work a scrape for 15 minutes, pot it out several times, and by the time he leaves, it's about 4 to 5 feet long and almost that wide. So not always scrape size is going to be the true indicator, but what you do want to look for, and I like to do this like in the postseason period, if you have a mild winter, even the winter months, but early spring mostly, is you want to find scrapes where there's like a lot of roots starting to be exposed, because that's a sign of more and more deer activity, more dirt being dug up. If it's just bare ground you're seeing, even though if it's a big area, it hasn't really been worked, for long or for many periods of time. But when you start to see multiple roots being dug up, or sometimes I've seen them so bad that they start to develop like an oval shape because they're just pawed out. Because 9 out of 10 times in the fall, a mature buck is going to not just put his scent on the licking branch, but he's going to scrape the dirt and then urinate in it. So that's a true sign of a very active scrape, is when you start to see the roots being dug up and starts to have that impression in the ground.
That leads me to another question. So when you're out there and you find a scrape like that, just put a camera on it and walk away, or do you hang a branch? What do you do? Or a vine, a branch, or do you just set the camera and leave?
No, that's a great question. Most of the time, I will hang a beech limb if there's beech in the area. I like to use beech limbs because they're one of the most durable branches you can use for a licking branch. They can take a beating, and they hold their leaves after they've been cut. Like, a beech limb will sometimes hold its leaves for a year after it's been cut, from the tree that it was on. And those leaves are an added attraction. They hold scent better. And I've just found that licking branches with leaves are more preferable to deer. Some people say, a lot of people really like grapevines. And I've up my way, I haven't had as much luck with grapevines as I have beech limbs. But we also don't have hardly any scrapes or much grapevine in general. So I like to keep it as natural as possible. I'm rarely ever putting scent on them. I don't believe there's a lot out there that can mimic the true scent that a deer has. And also, when I go to hunt a scrape, like, I don't like to walk up to that scrape and risk my own human scent being spread around that area just to put, deer scent there. Now, some people will say they have a lot of luck doing it, but I've had better luck just, hanging a good licking branch, even if it's a natural scrape, because what if you don't have a good licking branch? Like, the deer don't know that, but if it's not something that's going to hold up and that licking branch falls down and there's nothing within reach, most of the time that scrape's going to really shut down, or the activity will really decrease. So, you want to make sure that scrape's going to hold up for a good long period of time.
Yeah. Yeah, here where I hunt in central Pennsylvania, we got a combination of mountains and valleys and fields and things, and we have a ton of grapevine. And I think I sent you a picture, probably both of you at one point, where I've got, I think, 4 bucks in one picture around a scrape. One of them was licking the vine, one of them was pawing the ground, 2 other ones were just standing around it. So I like to hang vines here, but I've been thinking about doing like a little study of my own and almost putting like a vine in one part of the scrape and a beech in the other side part of the scrape and see what happens. You maybe have done that. I don't know, but
I absolutely did that only on 2 spots last year, and the beech limb crushed the vine. Now, like I said, I can't say that that's going to be the case everywhere else, but when a buck has never seen of probably a grapevine or especially a scrape made under a grapevine, but there's beech everywhere here usually. Like he's going to be more, interested in, okay, I've seen this before. I know this is a real scrape versus, what is that thing hanging there? And even with rope scrapes, like I don't do a lot of rope scrapes anymore because, they're not as natural. But if I do a rope scrape, I'm putting that out months in advance because you want to give the deer in that area as much time as possible to get used to that. And, you don't want to, from my experience also, you don't want to make a great or a rope scrape right now because we're getting right near hunting season. You want to hopefully establish the pattern where deer are frequenting right at that scrape and wanting to come in and, visit it frequently. Yeah.
one of the things I can tell you is, that picture of all those bucks around that vine, I got a lot of questions, people asking me, what pre-orbital scent did you use on that? And they can I think they almost think I'm lying when I tell them I didn't use anything.
Exactly. And I remember you asking me that question too. I was like, I'm telling you, it will work with no scent. Deer,
Yep.
that they have a lot of communication through scrapes, and their eyes are always on the lookout for those branches. Especially a vertical branch, which most of your really good scrapes are going to have a broken branch where it hangs vertically. So that's like a signal to deer, like, oh, okay, we got a scrape going over here. So these scrapes are more being found with their eyes than their nose. And then once deer do start frequenting them and putting their own scent on them, they're going to pick up that scent with their nose anyways.
Yeah. It was so hard for me not to put something on that branch or on that vine. I'm like, I don't know. Steve said don't do it. So
Well,
I mean, I'm not going to say that scent doesn't work at all, but I would at least say most of the products I've used haven't been that necessary, either a waste of money or a waste of time, and I've also seen negative effects at times too.
oh yeah, I've seen that.
Yep.
I think it's fascinating what you talked about, that vertical branch. And I was thinking when you first said that, it didn't make any sense to me. I'm like, what is that on a vertical branch? I'm like, that's called a tree trunk. And then I'm like, oh no, he's talking about, like you mentioned, you talked about broken. I'm like, okay, so that's actually something I'm going to try next, because I use the tree brackets, the strap-on brackets that hold the limbs. And the next time I do one, and actually I found good luck. This is another tip that people could piggyback with what you're talking about and what you found, Steve. If you create a mock scrape right in that late October, early November period, my trail cameras show that if I create a mock scrape and put a camera on it, if I do get a mature buck on that, it's almost always within the first 24 hours. They won't always come back, but it's exactly what you said, Steve. They'll see it, they'll recognize it as a new scrape. They're not familiar with it, so they want to come over. I'm telling you, if you create a scrape like in the afternoon of one day, I would hunt that the next morning. I would hunt that the next evening. That could be your best time. And I'm going to do what you just said, is I'm going to add that to my setup, where when I get my branch, and by the way, I don't know, I like to use oak limbs for the same reason. Oaks hold their leaves for a long time too after they dry out, Steve. And so If there's a lot of oak in the area where I'm hunting, I'll usually look for an oak sapling and cut a couple of limbs off of an oak. But anyway, I'm going to break one of those limbs off like you see, when the bucks have been thrashing around in there, and I'm going to break one of the small branches on that limb so it hangs down straight and see if I can't get, more deer to notice that.
You honestly, I think you will. Like when you're in the woods, there's all kinds of low overhanging branches. And I mean, deer, they're not going around checking every low hanging branch that they can see. But when they see that vertical branch hanging there, that's telling them, okay, there is a scrape going on here. And this is, especially for a mature buck that, is claimed dominance over an area, like he's definitely going to want to check that out because he wants to make sure he doesn't have any other competition or obviously he's also thinking, who's making this? Maybe there's bucks in that area that aren't scraping as much because it's right in his core area. So it plays a huge part, just that vertical limb. It's a real, I think more and more people are catching on to it, but it's definitely been a real game changer for me in my mock scrapes and even scrapes in general. Sometimes there isn't at a natural scrape, like there hasn't been that broken or vertical branch, but I'll add one to it, and almost always it will increase.
By the way, how are you adding that? Like, how do you hang the branch? So if you cut off a branch, are you hanging the thin part down, the thick part down? Are you tying it with paracord? What are you doing?
Yeah, I've done it in all kinds of different ways. I mean, I would say that like that thin steel wire for a long term situation, I would say the steel wire holds up better than anything else. The thicker end usually at the top.
Are you talking about
What's that?
steel fishing leader, or what do you mean steel wire?
Steel fishing leader would work good too, or they make just like I don't really know what it's used for, but you like at your hardware store, you can get a spool of steel wire that's just a little bit thicker than fishing line. But the only reason why I like that steel is I've had times where like a squirrel or a chipmunk or something, chewed it. Even my this year I've been using a lot of zip ties. They're really convenient. You throw 5 or 6 zip ties in your pocket. And, they work pretty good. However, I have had some of them get chewed as well, but nothing has ever went through the steel products that I've used. So that might be your best bet. But honestly, I've used string, paracord. Most of the time, anything like that holds up for quite a while. But I like to hang the thicker part of the branch up high. Especially, I like the thinner part of the branch. You want to maybe have some flexibility, especially like if deer are working it real heavy. If it flexes, it will actually last a little bit longer too, and not pull as heavily, on whatever you're tying it up with. And usually, the thinner part of the branch is what has the leaves, anyways. So, that's also another reason why they hang lower. Another thing too, I look for is when I cut a beech limb, a lot of times it has all kinds of little branches off it. I'll usually, snip all of those limbs except for like a bottom cluster, but I'll leave a little notch of a limb at that thicker end of it. And that's where I'll tie because that little notch of limb will hold that, whatever you're using, zip tie or whatever, it holds up better that way too. So something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I have a series of pictures of about a 300-pound black bear coming in and sitting down underneath my licking branch and just pulling on it. And I thought for sure that was going to be gone, but it had enough flexibility that he didn't take it down. I was surprised. I was surprised he didn't bring it down.
Yeah, and even the overall above the overhanging branch, not the vertical branch that I use, but whatever the vertical branch is tied to overhanging, I always check to make sure that has a lot of flexibility because whether it's a bear or deer, like the more give that has, the longer it's going to hold up as well.
And that's exactly what saved that one. It's the branch above it was just bouncing back up and down as he was pulling it. So
exactly. Yeah, that's a huge, especially if it's a spot you're not going to be able to get to very often, and you're really needing that scrape to hold up. That flexibility is going to really last in the long run.
Yeah.
Well, listen, guys, there's two more things I want to get to relatively quickly because we're probably coming up on the better part of an hour, but I've got to give you some time, Steve, to talk about all these other factors that we didn't discuss because we basically spent the entire episode talking about temperature, obviously as the number one factor. And then we had a really interesting conversation about scrapes and things related to that. But so don't go too deep on all this stuff, but talk to me about stuff like moon phase, moon position, precipitation, wind direction, a barometric pressure, all these other things that there are people out there, including some really successful deer hunters around the country who talk about this kind of stuff all the time and put huge stock in it. And you're like, well, I don't know what to tell you, but I got 6 years and millions of cameras or millions of photos, and I'm not seeing it.
Yeah,
Hey,
no.
I still have my rapid fire questions you promised me, Christian.
All right, we'll get to that. We'll rapid fire at the end, but he's got to touch on this because you know there's going to be guys listening to this who are like, no, it's a red moon. I hunt by the red moon. That's the only thing, you know, and whatever it is, there's another guy who thinks it's the first day after a low pressure system. When the rain clears out, he's got to be there. Or there's another guy who's like, hey, I know my buddy Clint Casper, who writes for us all the time. He's big on studying what wind direction a buck likes to move on, and he hunts the bucks on that. So I just want to give Steve a chance to kind of like say why he hasn't keyed in on any of these other factors.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you brought that up. So I'll start with least of a factor and then work my way to what I've also noticed to be greater factors of movement. And this might be a surprising one, but probably the moon has been the least of a factor for these spikes in movement. I have seen, and even last year, if I remember right, full moon was October 8th and I think November 8th. There was a little spike in movement right after those full moons, even last year. But overall, I have not seen the results and the same information that other people are giving you on whether it's moon position or phase, whatever. I'm not seeing hardly anything exciting when it comes to moon phase. Also, probably, another one that's talked about, and you brought that up, would be wind shifts. I think it also depends on which way the wind shifts more than just any wind shift. But here's another factor too. Like I did see great spikes in movement over the years on north wind shifts, but then usually that's a cold front. So do you blame that on the wind shift or do you blame that because the colder air approaching? I will say also that if you have a really good front rolling in, a lot of times that movement spikes even before the cold air gets here. You got a cold front coming on Friday. Don't be surprised if you see some big spikes of movement Wednesday or Thursday. So, that's where something else is beating the temperature, and it could be that wind shift. But the problem is, like I said, a lot of our cold fronts, we're getting either north or northwest winds. So, but like an east wind shift, I've seen major decreases in movement where some people say east wind is phenomenal because you hardly get them, but not for me. East wind, I think it might even bother mature bucks.
This is my proverb. When the wind is from the east, the hunting is the least.
Yeah, they say that for fishing too, and I kind of agree to that. I think if it's an unknown wind, it has more of a negative effect on movement because whenever deer feel insecure, generally they will move less. They will spend more time laying down in their bedding areas where they're more secure than anything else. So those odd winds, like an east wind, I've seen less movement. But north and west winds have always been the best for spikes and movement. Also, barometric pressure. I can't say that I've ever noticed like it has to be at a certain number, but once again, when it fluctuates quite a bit, that's when you'll see spikes in movement. Now, ultimately, though, another thing, and you touched on it a little bit, probably second to temperature would be precipitation. Like you brought up right after a rain, that's probably number two outside of a temperature spike or temperature drop. Like the longer it rains, like if you get like a rain where it's close to a 24-hour period, it doesn't let up, and then pow, it lets up. There's always a spike in movement. Some really good spikes, especially. So right after a rain is really really good, and also those first couple snows we get every year in the rut. A lot of times we'll get a snow like first second week of November. There's always spikes in movement those first couple snows. I can't say I know the exact reason, but keeping track of that information, you throw the weather down and you look, oh wow, it was even cold on Monday, but then it snowed on Tuesday, and look how it even spiked even more. Like that's what I'm seeing. So those first few snows every rut or every fall, they're always really good. But like I said, other than that though, nothing has been able to come close to cold temps in my studies. But this is only from October 1st to December 10th, so I can't say that some of those other factors can't outweigh at different times of year too.
And it's buck movement, not just any deer movement.
Yeah, correct. It's buck movement, and I do think does are less affected by everything because does tend to stick to a smaller area, but they move a lot within that area.
Yeah,
like a mature buck. He's more he's selective on his movements. He's more selective about where he's going to move. So it takes something out of the ordinary to really get him out of his comfort zone and want to range. And once again, that's in my studies, it's been combined with time of year, and temperature seems to really be the greatest factor. And honestly, going into this, I never thought that, once again, that temperature was going to be it. But when you do a study like this, you just sit back and let the data speak for itself, and that's what I've done.
All right. So do you have time for some rapid fire?
No, you're questions? Not up. You're not up yet, Silks. I got one more. You're at the end. No, you're at the end, John. I don't care. You're at the end.
That's fine.
Back. I'm not done. Oh, fascinating though. I was thinking about two things as Steve was talking, by the way. First of all, he talked about unknown winds. I've smelled a few unknown winds when you were in hunting camp with John. And the other thing is he was talking about right after a rain, I killed my best buck ever out at Bob and Marsh's right after a day like that. It was heavy, heavy rain, had moved in the previous afternoon, and it rained all night. And we knew from the radar that it was still going to be raining at sunrise. And we decided that we would sleep in that next morning, that we'd have breakfast at 9 o'clock, and we'd look at the weather and make a plan. And it looked like it was going to let up around 10 o'clock. So we got ready around 10 and went out. And there was a massive flurry of activity that morning, like in the first 60 to 90 minutes after the rain stopped. And I killed like 163-inch buck that morning. It was awesome. Yeah.
That's number two. Like I said, right after a rain is almost as exciting as like I said, those prime temperatures. So I totally agree.
So my last question, and I promise you, John, the rest of the show is yours after this.
But 30 seconds, right? I get 30 seconds.
Now, anybody who runs as many trail cameras as Steve does, for as many years as Steve does, we would really be remiss if we didn't ask him just some general trail camera tips. Like, do you have like 8 or 10 different brands of cameras out there, or do you use all the same thing? And, do you use a certain kind of battery? Do you use wireless cameras? I mean, it's a big question. Don't go too long, but like, what has experience shown you to be the best sort of all around choice for your needs when it comes to cameras and just getting the best life out of them?
Yeah, I would say a higher quality camera, you're going to get longer out of it. But I will also say like you can spend $200 on a camera and it'll probably last you 5 or 6 years. you can spend $50 on a camera and it probably lasts you 3 years. So they kind of even out too. It's just if you don't want to have to make an extra trip to the store every 3 years, I think they kind of match up as far as how much money you're spending. But for me, like in my best spots, I usually put a higher quality camera just because I don't want to miss out on that intel. Then in a lot of areas that I feel may not be as good, or it's a completely new spot, I'll put a cheaper camera. So I have all kind of a mix. Like I have probably every brand. Well, not every, but most of the brands of trail cameras I have. I'm always watching out for a sale. Occasionally a company will give me some too, but there's a whole plethora of variety, and I if I could afford to run, all $200-300 cameras, I would. But on public land and the amount that I'm running, I mean, my wife, I would definitely be divorced. It's tempting to do that, but I wouldn't be married to this day if I was spending that much money. So, I'm definitely looking out for the financial standpoint, and I'm still having good success even with a lot of these cheaper ones. As far as batteries go, I pretty much quit using lithium batteries just because of the price of them. I mainly use Railback, the alkaline. There's a store here where I live in Bradford, PA, that I can usually get like 100 batteries for around $30. And in my experience, I kind of think that you're getting almost just as much, even though lithium is going to last longer. But I mean, I just bought lithiums the other day. I bought 12 of them, and it cost almost $50. So yeah, I might be putting batteries in the camera a little more often by using alkaline, but still in the long run, I actually think the alkalines could be cheaper.
Yeah,
Uh,
I just priced a 100 count yesterday, and I paid $34 for 100 alkaline batteries, or I could have spent $259 on 100 lithium batteries. That's a lot of
I
money.
I
yeah,
got you both beat. I got 100 Amazon Basics. I've got them right here. These are good batteries too. Like, no, seriously, I've used the Ravax. These Amazon Basics,
Yep.
$21 for 100. It was a promotional
that's a
price.
great.
21 bucks for 100. It was because I signed up for a subscription, and they give you it was an extra like 10% or something off of my, no, 40. I think it was an extra
Yeah,
40% off my first order or something.
because that's the
Yeah.
exact same thing I just bought, Christian, for 34. I didn't sign up for the subscription.
Yeah, I got it for 21. So there you go. Read it
And
and weep, baby. Okay, John, we got to wrap this up. It's almost 10 after 1. You've got it, man. Rapid fire. Steve, you've got to keep your answers to 30 seconds or less.
all right.
All right, first question. Now that everybody and their brother has learned to look for 4 and 5-year-old timber cuts, how's somebody supposed to stay in the game? Everybody, that the whole public land thing has exploded out of this world, and everybody is out there looking for these cuts, and now they're getting crowded. So what's the next best thing? Do you just put boots on the ground and find those scrapes, or is there something else that people should be looking for?
Yeah, and I think this is something we talked about the other day, so I'm glad you brought it back up. But yeah, I've turned more into a boots on the ground hunter and scouter just for that exact reason. I'm hardly hunting clear cuts at all because your number one enemy, and I don't know if enemy is the right word, but
Right.
when you throw hunting pressure in there, everything changes. So you want to be able to avoid hunting pressure, and you want to always be evolving and adapting to what other hunters are doing around you. So definitely boots on the ground. Finding more remote, hard to access areas, looking for sign in those areas, and just to keep it short and sweet. Just like I said, just be different and constantly pay attention to what other hunters are doing. I would focus more on the boots on the ground stuff.
All right, so that brings me right into another question. So we've all heard, boots on the ground. That I've heard that. You got to put the time in. You got to put the boots on the ground. That goes a little bit in contradiction to big bucks won't tolerate disturbance. So is it just locate with boots on the ground and then get light on, your, presence in the area? Is that how you do that? Because obviously, you don't want to bump the bucks out. You just want to locate.
Yeah, and I will say that when I'm doing extensive boots on the ground, it's usually postseason scouting. That's when I'm really dissecting areas very thoroughly. So unfortunately, at this time, heavy boots on the ground could be a factor. I mean, what if you do bump a buck one time? It's usually not like it's over with and he's long and gone, but you still got to play it more on the safe side. But the boots on the ground should be done heavily in the off season.
Well,
Great.
I got to add, one thing there too, John, and this I'm going to give credit to Clint Casper, who says this in some of his articles. But I agree. If it's right in the period that we've been talking about today, right, third week of October through the first 2 weeks of November, and you're doing some boots on the ground, but you're doing it with a stand on your back, because you're planning to hunt either like right then or the next day or something like that. It's not the end of the world if you bump a buck, because that's the time of the year that any number of bucks can be coming and going from that area. So if you find an area with a whole bunch of sign, even if you happen to bump a deer, the odds that that's the only buck that's in that area at that time are slim. And you're going to get up and you're going to hunt. So unless you're hunting a buck and you only want to kill that deer, if you're just looking for a good buck, then you can get away with a little bit more during those peak periods in terms of moving around and hunting than you probably could in September or January.
Yep.
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
All right. Next question. The disappearing buck. We've all dealt with it. We all deal with it. I hear these guys getting all excited about trail cam pictures that they're getting right now. I know you're getting some great trail cam pictures, but how often do we get to the season and everybody's like, I just don't know what happened to them? I mean, I've seen people's seasons just crumble because they couldn't figure out what happened to those bucks. What do you do to stay on those bucks? Like, how do you track them?
Well, that's, especially when you're running as many trail cameras as me. I mean, I think that is an advantage. I'm not saying you got to run 150, but run as many as you can. And I will also say that a lot of these people think these bucks disappear and they're long gone, miles away, when I find the complete opposite. Like, there's been times just because of change in food source or hunting pressure that a buck is just shifting ever so slightly. And hunters fail to adjust in these situations. They've had that buck at that spot all summer, then he disappears, and they expect him to eventually come back, or the hunter will completely pull out of that spot versus trying to figure out the reason why that deer left. But most of them, like I said, are not as far as what you think. It's just a matter of their habitat's changing, their bodies are changing this time of year. Whole bunch is going on that you would have to expect some kind of a shift.
So you could put like a 3 or 4 camera spread around there trying to locate them. You don't.
Yeah, like one thing is food sources are changing. It goes from green browse and maybe it goes to acorns. Like, start finding the acorns in that area. Bucks are also going to be more around thick cover when they break up from bachelor groups. Have cameras around the thicker areas, or learn the bedding in those areas. It's all based on biology. You can expect this change every year. It happens every year.
Do you notice, another question real quick, do you notice if you start to see black bear family frequenting your camera, does that just blow the deer out, or do they live peacefully together, or what happens to the bucks?
It depends on the area. Like, if it's a bedding area, or a lot of times too, like I see them when there's a good elk or acorn crop. If you have a ton of bears in that area, it does tend to push the deer, especially some daytime feeding, because bears will feed all day. They're not like deer. They'll feed right at noon on a hot day. But it seems like areas where deer want to be more concentrated, that will bother deer and kind of push them out some. But if it's just like a travel corridor where both animals just kind of use, but not so much to a patternable standpoint, it's just kind of, unpredictable. I mean, I'll have bear, deer, coyotes, bobcats all in one day on one camera, but it just depends on what is happening in that area.
All right, my final question. So I had and I'm going to put you on the spot here. This is the Steve Sherk truth moment. So I was told by a very successful public land hunter in Pennsylvania that there's like one or two keys to their success in public land that they won't tell people and that you won't tell people. Is there a secret out there that you're keeping from us, Steve? We need to know.
Absolutely. There's secret deer. There's many, many secrets. And I will say, I'm sure like I do scouting classes. I hold a couple scouting camps. Like, it's amazing because so many of these people follow me on social media and they listen to these podcasts and they're like, holy cow, Steve, like this is all stuff or a lot of stuff that you've never talked about, because I'm okay with telling a group of 10 versus thousands. I'll give a little bit to someone that I can basically share a secret with, but there's definitely a lot of secrets.
All right. So, Christian, we have to be a part of that group of 10 here next time.
Well, I was going to say it's a great way to end, because what Steve's really saying is if you want, I mean, I actually thought this was a fascinating episode. I think there's a ton of great information stuff that I'm going to use this fall, John. I'm going to key in on those 30-30 days for sure. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of really good stuff, but if people do want a little bit more of Steve Sherk's secret sauce, you've got to connect with him a little more personally, a little more intimately. And so how can people do that? You mentioned social media, Steve. What are your social media handles? Do you have a website? I know you have a guide service. So how can people who listen to this and they're like, man, I need me some more Steve Sherk. How do I get it?
Plus he has classes like with people in person too.
Well, let them tell us about it.
Yep. Throughout the summer, like I've been doing classes, July, August. The last one's going to be the first Saturday of September. I also do quite a few of these in the field scouting classes in like the early spring, late winter period. I don't do them anywhere close to hunting season because I'm taking these people right in areas that, that I'm hunting or plan to hunt. But yeah, that's like I said, whether you want to attend a scouting camp or you want to do like a half-day class or interested in booking a hunt, I only have social media anymore. I actually had to tame down the amount of people contacting me. I was getting so many calls, especially from my website, and not always even just wanting to book a hunt, but like, hey, Steve, my name's John Smith, and I just wanted to ask you some questions about deer hunting, like calling me like nonstop. And I don't want to say I'm not like offended, or it's just like I had to cut down on just the amount of work that I was doing, just interacting with people. So I knew that, my best following and maybe the most supportive people were on social media. So I just have Facebook and Instagram right now, but you can just find me at either one, Sherk's Guide Service, SHERK' Guide Service. And that's, like I said, that's the best way to contact me. I don't really like to have my phone number totally available, or, shoot me a message on there, and be glad to talk to anyone.
Well, I'll tell you what, John. Well, I don't think that Bowhunter TV has ever done a public land Pennsylvania hunt, but maybe we
about it.
You talked to Waring about it?
Yeah, you're out, buddy. I'm already in.
Well, you said that next year. I got room for Bowhunter TV this year, so if they want to come, let me know.
Wow, we may have to do that, John. We may have to do that this year. I know that I'm not doing a lot of travel this year, and we both have our Pennsylvania tags, and I don't have anything too exciting on my trail cameras locally here. So I'm kind of up for making the road trip up to Sherk's Paradise.
Yeah, no, we'd love to have you. Like I said, we got everything you need here. All you need to bring is your hunting gear, and obviously, we got big deer and what you're looking for. So if you guys want to bring the show up, we'd love it.
And you'll never see anybody more positive than Mr. Berg in camp. He believes it can happen at any minute.
Well,
So-
I can only come if John says I can, because really I'm like a coattail holder on guy. John's the one that, turned me on to you. So anyways, man, that was a great episode. Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks, John, for reminding me that I know the first time we had Steve on, we talked about coming back and diving more into that long-term study that he has going. And it really was good stuff. And perfect timing for, just as we're getting ready to head into the season here.
Yeah, thanks, Steve.
Thanks a lot for having me, guys. And if I don't hear from you in the near future, best of luck to you. But I'll keep a couple spots open just in case you guys need to get up here this fall.
Thanks for downloading the Petersen's Bowhunting Podcast. All bow hunting, all the time. Pick up the latest issue of Petersen's Bowhunting Magazine on your local newsstand. Or connect with us online at bowhuntingmag.com.